September 1944. Europe had been bleeding for 5 years under the yoke of the most devastating war humanity had ever witnessed. Since the successful Normandy landings in June, Allied forces had advanced at a speed that surprised even the most optimistic military planners. Paris had been liberated in August, and Allied troops were pushing the remnants of the German army across France and Belgium with seemingly unstoppable momentum. Optimism was contagious. Many believed the war could be over before Christmas, but logistics, that great silent enemy of all armies, was beginning to take its toll. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles from the beaches of Normandy, and every tank, every truck, every soldier competed for fuel and ammunition that simply could not arrive fast enough. The Allied advance began to slow, and with it, the window of opportunity to end the war quickly threatened to close. It was in this context that Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the British hero of El Alamein, presented the Allied Supreme Command with a plan that promised to solve everything at once. A plan so audacious that it would make D-Day itself seem modest in comparison. Operation Market Garden. The concept was brilliant in its simplicity and terrifying in its ambition. 3 airborne divisions would be dropped over the Netherlands to capture a series of bridges over the main rivers and canals that cut across the country from south to north. Simultaneously, the powerful British XXX Armoured Corps would advance by land along a single road, crossing each captured bridge until reaching the final objective, the large road bridge over the Lower Rhine in the city of Arnhem. If everything went according to plan, the Allies would have a direct route to the industrial heart of Germany, the Ruhr Valley, bypassing the formidable Siegfried Line. The war, Montgomery argued, could be over in weeks. The market part referred to the airborne component. The American 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, would capture the bridges further south near Eindhoven and Son. The American 82nd Airborne Division, the All-Americans, would take the bridges at Nijmegen and Grave, and the most distant and dangerous task would fall to the British 1st Airborne Division, to capture the bridge at Arnhem, the last and most crucial of all. The garden part was the XXX Corps, which was to cover more than 100 kilometers in just 2 to 3 days along a single narrow road that would become known as the Hell Corridor. But there were serious problems that were ignored or downplayed. Aerial reconnaissance photographs showed the presence of German tanks near Arnhem. Major Brian Urquhart, an intelligence officer, alerted his superiors to the presence of the 2 SS Panzer Corps in the region. He was ignored and removed from his duties on the grounds of nervous stress. The Dutch resistance sent similar warnings. They were also dismissed. Arrogance and optimism had blinded the Allied command. On Sunday, September 17, 1944, the skies over England roared with the sound of more than 1,500 transport planes and gliders taking off from dozens of airfields. It was the largest airborne operation ever mounted in the history of warfare. An air armada stretching over 150 kilometers, carrying nearly 35,000 soldiers into the skies over Holland. Inside the C-47 Dakota aircraft, thousands of paratroopers faced their own personal demons. Some prayed silently, others wrote hasty letters to loved ones. Many feigned courage they did not feel, exchanging forced jokes that barely disguised the fear they all shared. The red light inside the aircraft bathed their faces in an ominous glow, while the deafening noise of the engines made conversation impossible. When the formation crossed the Dutch coast, civilians looked up at the sky with amazement and hope. For those living under German occupation, those planes represented the promise of liberation. Children pointed, women wept with joy. Men took off their hats in silent reverence. But the Germans were also looking up, and their reaction was immediate and lethal. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, filling the sky with black bursts of flak and lines of tracers. Planes were hit. some exploding in mid-air, others trailing smoke as their pilots struggled to maintain formation long enough for the paratroopers to jump. When the green light finally came on, the men leaped into the void. Thousands of white parachutes bloomed over the Dutch landscape like deadly flowers. Horsa and Hamilcar gliders spiraled down to land in farm fields, their wooden fuselages breaking and splintering on impact. Jeeps, light guns, and troops poured out of the shattered gliders and immediately began to organize. The landing field was controlled chaos. Colored smoke marked assembly points. Officers blew whistles and shouted orders. Supply containers descended on colorful parachutes. Amidst it all, cows ran in panic across fields that minutes before had been peaceful pastures. Near Arnhem, Field Marshal Walter Model, one of the most capable German commanders, was having lunch at the Hotel Tafelberg in Oosterbeek when the first paratroopers began to fall a few hundred yards from his position. In a moment of supreme irony of war, the top German commander in the region was almost captured in the first minute of the operation. Model fled hastily, but contrary to what the Allies expected, his reaction was not one of panic. Within hours, he would begin to organize one of the most efficient counter-offensives of the war. 4. 6. The Corridor of Hell and the Battles of the South. While the paratroopers organized themselves at the landing zones, British artillery opened a devastating barrage to clear the way for XXX Corps. Hundreds of guns thundered simultaneously, and the Irish Guards' Sherman tanks began to advance along the narrow Dutch road. But the advance lasted only a few kilometers before falling into a deadly ambush. German 88mm anti-tank guns, the dreaded Act 8, and Panzerfaust teams opened fire from the tree lines flanking the road. The lead tank exploded in flames, and the others were trapped on the narrow road, unable to swerve into the surrounding flooded fields. The bottleneck that everyone feared became a bloody reality in the early hours. Further north, the 101st Airborne had achieved most of its objectives, but suffered a devastating blow when the Germans blew up the Sun Bridge right before the eyes of the Americans who were rushing in. The river crossing had to be improvised, costing precious hours that the plan simply did not have to spare. The liberation of Eindhoven, however, provided one of the most exciting moments of the operation. Thousands of Dutch civilians flooded the streets in ecstasy, throwing flowers, kissing soldiers, waving orange flags. For a few glorious hours, the war seemed a distant memory, replaced by an explosion of joy that men and women would remember for the rest of their lives, but the joy would be short-lived. The following night, German bombers would attack Eindhoven, turning the streets of celebration into smoldering ruins. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost led his 2nd Parachute Battalion on a forced march toward the bridge at Arnhem. Of the 3 routes planned to reach the bridge, only Frost's managed to penetrate the German defenses that were forming with frightening speed. When his men finally reached the north end of the bridge at dusk, they managed to occupy several buildings overlooking the access ramp, but they controlled only one side. And then one of the most dramatic moments of the war occurred. A German armored column attempted to cross the bridge from the south. Frost's paratroopers opened fire with everything they had. Vehicles exploded, creating a wall of fire that blocked the bridge. The night turned into a hell of orange flames, reflected in the waters of the Rhine. Frost and his men held the bridge for almost 4 days. 4 days of uninterrupted combat against Tiger tanks and SS troops that vastly outnumbered them. The radios, equipped with frequencies unsuitable for the wooded terrain of Holland, had failed almost completely. The 1st Airborne Division was fighting blind and deaf, unable to coordinate its battalions or call for reinforcements and supplies. The buildings around the bridge were set on fire one by one. The wounded piled up in dark basements where medics operated by candlelight with supplies that were quickly running out. Ammunition was rationed bullet by bullet. The men fought with a ferocity that earned the respect of even their SS enemies. When the bridge position finally fell, the survivors were taken prisoner. Frost, wounded, was carried away on a stretcher. German officers ordered their troops to salute as the British prisoners marched past. It was a rare and genuine tribute to one of the most heroic acts of resistance in World War II. In Nijmegen, the 82nd Airborne faced its own crisis. The road bridge over the wide Waal River remained in German hands, and every attempt to capture it by conventional means failed in the face of fierce defense. General James Gavin then made one of the most daring decisions of the war: to cross the river in broad daylight in canvas boats under direct enemy fire. The boats were fragile, some did not even have enough oars. Soldiers used rifle butts to row. The 400-meter crossing turned into a bloodbath. German machine guns tore through the canvas boats like paper. Mortars exploded in the water, sending up columns of spray and shrapnel. Men fell into the icy water, swept away by the current. Boats sank with soldiers struggling to swim in full gear. Those who survived the crossing reached the north bank like men possessed. Soaked, bleeding, furious at the carnage they had endured, they assaulted the German positions with a violence that brooked no surrender. The bridge was finally captured, but the cost in lives was devastating. And when they looked south, expecting to see the tanks of XXX Corps crossing the bridge they had won with so much blood, they saw only an empty road. XXX Corps was late again. The frustration and anger of the survivors of the Waal crossing was palpable. The remnants of the 1st Airborne Division, unable to reach the bridge after Frost's fall, formed a desperate defensive perimeter around the village of Oosterbeek. The Hotel Hartenstein, an elegant establishment that served as headquarters, was transformed into a besieged fortress. The fighting in Oosterbeek was brutally intimate. Paratroopers fought from garden to garden, house to house. Bren gun positions were set up behind greenhouses. Grenades were thrown over hedges. Clothes still hung on clotheslines, while men died in flower beds. War had invaded suburban domesticity with surreal obscenity. Kate ter Horst, an extraordinary Dutch woman, turned her home into a makeshift hospital. Dozens of wounded were accommodated in every room as she cared for them, read the Bible to them, and offered comfort with a courage that transcended any military definition of heroism. RAF planes desperately attempted to drop supplies, but the perimeter had shrunk so much that most of the cargo fell on German territory. Pilots flew at suicidally low altitudes to increase accuracy, and many paid with their lives. Paratroopers watched helplessly as their desperately needed supplies drifted gently down on colorful parachutes straight into the hands of the enemy. General Sosabowski's Polish parachute brigade finally jumped south of the Rhine at Driel, but arrived too late and was unable to cross the river under heavy fire. The bridge at Arnhem was now an impossible dream. Tutbussustun 14. The withdrawal and the balance of defeat. On the night of September 25, 26, 9 days after the start of the operation, the survivors of the 1st Airborne Division received the order to evacuate. Operation Berlin, as the withdrawal was called, was carried out. In conditions of absolute secrecy, boots were wrapped in rags to muffle footsteps. Soldiers advanced in total darkness, each man holding the jacket of the man in front of him. The wounded who could not walk had to be left behind. This was perhaps the most distressing moment of the entire operation. Men who had fought side by side for days said goodbye in silence, knowing they would probably never see each other again. Medics voluntarily remained with the wounded, knowing they would be captured. The crossing of the Rhine in the darkness was chaotic and deadly. Crowded assault boats crossed under sporadic fire that intensified when the Germans finally realized the escape. Some soldiers swam, others drowned in the icy darkness. Of the more than 10,000 men that the 1st Airborne Division had dropped into Holland, fewer than 2,500 made it back across the river. The division had been effectively destroyed as a fighting force. In total, Operation Market Garden cost the Allies more than 17,000 casualties, including dead, wounded and prisoners. Dutch civilians suffered even more. German reprisals included the forced evacuation of Arnhem and the imposition of a food embargo that caused the Hunger Winter of 1944-45, killing more than 20,000 Dutch civilians from starvation. Montgomery declared that the operation had been 90% successful. It was a statement that insulted the memory of the dead. 90%. Success in an operation where the only goal that really mattered was the last one. The bridge at Arnhem was the equivalent of saying that heart surgery had been 90% successful, except for the heart. What went wrong with Market Garden was not a single catastrophic failure, but a cascade of errors, arrogant assumptions, and bad luck that combined to create a disaster. Intelligence about the presence of German armor in Arnhem was ignored. Radios were inadequate for the terrain. Landing zones were too far from the objectives. Reliance on a single road was an invitation to disaster. And above all, the plan required everything to go right simultaneously, with no margin for error in any of its multiple interdependent components. General Sosabowski, whose Polish brigade had fought with extreme bravery, was made a scapegoat by the British command to protect the reputations of their own generals. It was an injustice that would take decades to correct. The operation brought bitter lessons about the limits of military audacity. The line between brilliant daring and reckless folly is often visible only in hindsight. Montgomery bet everything on a single roll of the dice, and the dice fell on the wrong side. Today, 80 years after the battle, the Oosterbeek Airborne Cemetery remains one of the most beautiful and moving war memorials in the world. Rows of white headstones stretch beneath centuries-old trees, each marking the final resting place of a young man who gave his all for a cause he believed to be just. Every September, Dutch children come to the cemetery to place flowers on each grave individually. This tradition, maintained uninterrupted since 1945, is perhaps the most eloquent expression of gratitude that a people can offer. Generations of children who have never known war learn, through this simple act, the meaning of sacrifice and remembrance. The bridge at Arnhem was renamed John Frost Bridge in honor of the commander who defended it so determinedly. Today, cars and bicycles cross peacefully over the same structure that once burned with the fire of destroyed armored vehicles. Hotel Hartenstein now houses the Airborne Museum, preserving history for future generations. The fields where thousands of parachutes blanketed the sky are once again peaceful meadows. The streets of Oosterbeek, where men fought from garden to garden, are once again peaceful residential neighborhoods, with children playing in the same backyards where soldiers died. Life has returned with a stubborn insistence that is in itself the greatest tribute to those who fought for it to return. Market Garden is often remembered for the famous phrase attributed to Lieutenant General Frederick Browning, "I think we may be going one bridge too far." Whether he actually said these words before the operation or whether they are a later construction is debated by historians, but the phrase captures with poetic precision the essence of what happened. The last operation was a brutal reminder that in war, as in life, the distance between ambition and disaster can be measured in bridges. Each bridge captured represented a triumph of human sacrifice, but the last bridge, the one that really mattered, remained a bridge too far. The men who fought in Market Garden, whether American, British, Polish, Canadian or Dutch, demonstrated a courage that transcends nationalities and generations. From the paratroopers who jumped into hostile skies to the tank, drivers who advanced through a corridor of fire, from the medics who saved lives in dark basements to the civilians who opened their homes to wounded soldiers, each wrote with their actions a chapter of heroism that time cannot erase. As long as the Rhine River continues to flow under the John Frost Bridge, as long as Dutch children continue to place flowers on white marble gravestones, as long as books continue to be written and documentaries continue to be produced, the memory of Market Garden will remain alive, not as a celebration of war, but as a solemn reminder of the price of freedom and the dangers of arrogance. The last veterans of this battle are disappearing. Soon, there will be no living witnesses left to those 9 days in September that changed so many lives, but their legacy lives on in the rebuilt cities, the carefully maintained cemeteries, and the silent gratitude of a people who have never forgotten what was sacrificed in their name. To those who gave everything, to those who return bearing visible and invisible scars, to those who still wait in silent rows of white stone, we remember. We will always remember. A bridge too far, but never too far to be remembered.